is that voting's limited to white male property holders.
Awesome. And you were talking about earlier, it's Dickinson who really, is it Dickinson or is it Wilson who really kind of pushed for a more open vote for the president?
So it's James Wilson of Pennsylvania that's pushing for the national popular vote for president.
Sorry, I got stuck two Pennsylvanians in my head and they were in combat with each other. So Wilson, calls at the convention and says, no, what about a more popular vote? But we don't really see that popular vote start to kick in until the Jacksonian era. So can you tell us a little bit of how it changed in the age of Andrew Jackson?
Yeah, so we're getting into the 1820s and into the 1830s, the age of Jackson. The key move here is towards universal white male suffrage. And so we see states abolishing property requirements. And whereas at the founding, poor white men that did not own property could not vote, we see with the Jacksonian age, they are now given the right to vote. So again, this is not the case of the founding, it's the case once we get into the Jacksonian age. But at the same time, we see other restrictions for many other groups, including women and African Americans. By 1855, 5 states, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont, had African American male voting. So, I mean, that's not zero. There were 5 states prior to the Civil War allowing African American men the right to vote, but that's a small number of states. The other key thing we see during this period, Curry, as we get into the 1840s and 1848, is that we see the Seneca Falls Convention. We can see the seeds of the women's suffrage movement. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott bringing together supporters of women's rights in Seneca Falls, New York. Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes the Declaration of Sentiments, which is the key document from this proceeding. And it says, it has this great language, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. So it's actually a rewriting of the Declaration of Independence. But in the end, it calls for a series of things that the convention thought was important for the equality of women in America, including equal education, equal pay, property rights, and the, quote, sacred right to the elective franchise. Again, these are the seeds of the women's suffrage movement that would expand in the decades to come and eventually culminate with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, and as to African American women, culminate with the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Awesome. And I love how you're really kind of explaining this interwovenness, this bound up together of equality and the right to vote, because you see that in the women's rights movement and you see that in the ending of slavery. And at first, those two giant pushes forward for change were bound together and then split around the 15th Amendment. But maybe we, take a beat or two on looking at the Reconstruction era and see how fighting for equality and fighting for freedom for African Americans is connected to having voice and agency for those who write the laws and govern you.
Yeah, key period of transformational change is Reconstruction. This is the period after the Civil War. We ratify 3 transformational amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, ratified in 1865. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, wrote promises of freedom and equality into the Constitution. And the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, banned racial discrimination in voting. This is all an effort to set new constitutional baselines after the Civil War. Many scholars refer to it as America's second founding. But these amendments grow out of a larger discourse that was decades and decades in the making, especially with African Americans themselves saying what it would take for them to get equal citizenship in the United States. You could see this powerful quote from Frederick Douglass after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. The revolution wrought in our condition by the 15th Amendment is almost startling, even to me. I view it with something like amazement. So African Americans had met in convention before and after the Civil War, explaining to America what was necessary, what sort of rights they needed. One of the key ones was voting rights. What they effectively said is, give us the power to protect ourselves, give us the right to vote, and then just wait to see what happens. Just give us the right to vote. It's central to every other right. And during Reconstruction, it's a brief period, but it's a really powerful and transformational one. We see America's first experiment in multiracial democracy, and for a brief period, it actually worked. We see African Americans voting in massive numbers. We see them holding office at all levels of government. We see African Americans as U.S. senators and U.S. House members, governors, state legislators, all the way down to local officials like sheriffs and justices of the peace. But sadly, as the decades wound on and we get closer and closer to the 20th century, We see them lose political power. We see white Southerners take control again in those Southern states and impose a system of Jim Crow. Part of Jim Crow were a series of devices used to keep African Americans from the ballot box, things like poll taxes and literacy tests, and those were mixed with violence to decrease African American voter participation. And once Jim Crow takes hold, it would take decades upon decades of efforts by another movement, the civil rights movement, to eventually culminate in many of the achievements we see in the 1950s, but especially the 1960s, with the landmark achievement being the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which Congress passes under the authority it got from the Reconstruction amendments to enforce the right to vote for African Americans. And ultimately, the Supreme Court would uphold the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act in a case called South Carolina v. Katzenbach in 1966.
It's unbelievably powerful, and to feel that like a roller coaster of freedom and rights and achievement, and then suppression and oppression. And I really appreciate how you point out that it's not just the legal ramifications, like the Jim Crow laws and the poll taxes, but also the oppression and violence for registering to vote, to being at the voting booths. And it takes another 100 years for the 14th and the 15th Amendment to kick in. Now, we see this, you talked a little bit about it earlier, about that beginning germination of the women's rights movement, connecting that fight for equality for women and the vote for women, leading to the 19th Amendment in 1920. But as we kind of walk through that, do you want to hit just a few of the key cases? I was thinking Minor v. Havenstead, to talk about how women looked at the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment and said, hey, what about us too?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there was, what's interesting is that if you look even before the Civil War and into Reconstruction, women suffragists and the African American community at large were allies. They were allies to fight slavery. They were allies right after the Civil War, trying to advance a vision of universal human rights. But with the ratification of the 15th Amendment, Congress at the time and the political leaders effectively chose African American men's political rights over the rights of women at the ballot box. And this outraged many members of the women's suffrage movement, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. But we had this amazing period right after this division where women look to the 14th Amendment and they say, look, we're citizens under the 14th Amendment, and voting is a privilege or immunity of national citizenship protected by the 14th Amendment. Even without a women's suffrage amendment, we get the right to vote. And so they make this argument, they bring it to court in a case called Minor v. Haversack. It's known as the New Departure, is the name of this movement for women's suffragists, trying to lay claim to the Constitution as it existed and saying, Supreme Court recognize our right to vote. Ultimately, in Minor v. Haversack, the Supreme Court would say no in a unanimous decision. They'd reject this challenge. But it's important to remember, it's a reminder that women's suffragists, they're not just fighting for constitutional amendments, but they're also making arguments under the Constitution as it existed to try to advance the cause of voting rights for women.
And I think it's interesting to really understand the Constitution, but then also push to say, well, we need something. And you've said this before in our classes, to take the values of what we believe in, the Voting Rights Act and women's right to vote, and put it in the Constitution and really spell it out clearly as well. We also, we see changes happen in the 1920s around Native Americans as well. So we start to begin to see the incorporation of Native Americans as citizens and therefore their right to vote. So can you tell us a little bit about why this change happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. It grants all Native Americans citizenship. And 1924, it's significant because this is a response in part to Native Americans fighting in World War I. So it's this continuation of this theme we've seen at different periods in American history, where once certain groups are willing to fight and die for their country, they often are then, granted new rights by the American community. So we saw this with African Americans, with African American soldiers fighting in the Civil War. Frankly, we saw this with women. When their loyalty on the home front during World War I was another key argument in support of women's suffrage, eventually culminating in the 19th Amendment in 1920. And as we already said, as we said earlier, this is also the story of the 26th Amendment, where young people willing to fight and die in the Vietnam War were then giving new protections for voting rights once we get the 26th Amendment ratified. So again, it's Native Americans being part of this broader story of granting additional rights once people prove their bravery on the battlefield.
Awesome. And now, as we kind of wrap into ending class, there is a great question from the students. I want to make sure I get it right. So, our classroom in Arkansas would like to know, do you think there will be a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College? Why or why not? I love the question.
I mean, it is one of the most debated topics over time. There have been a ton of proposals throughout a lot of American history to amend the Electoral College. Again, the 12th Amendment itself was a way of amending the Electoral College all the way back in 1804. You know, as a matter of practicality, the thing to remember about constitutional amendments are they're really hard to pass. And so it requires a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of the states calling for that reform. That's the main process used for each amendment that we've added to the Constitution. And so for something like that, a structural change to happen, it's going to require broad bipartisan support for the push for reform. And so I think that just as a practical matter, I think the most likely scenario in which you would see a broad push for electoral college reform would be if both parties have seen themselves harmed over time by this system. They may then come together and come up with a new one. I think, but it's always, when it comes to constitutional reform, it's always a way of which, how can you find something that has broad enough support to attract, you know, the founders would have said different factions. Today we would say different parties. It really requires very broad support for any change.
And we have a 27 amendment class that's coming up in a few months. I think December, where we talk about Article 5 and like what really happened to make these 27 amendments pass. So I think it's a great question about what would make the right atmosphere for that amendment to be passed. But at the same time, the cool part about the states experimenting is states like Nebraska and how they look at what kind of opportunities. And New York was talking, a group from New York in the last class was talking about how New York is leading the way in things like basing their state out of district votes. So the electoral votes are split across the state. So it's not a winner take all, but also ranked choice voting and lots of other opportunities. So it's kind of fascinating what the states will come up with. Now, Fred has another question.
I was going to say another key strategy, though, Curry, from our great friend Akhil Amar is on constitutional reform. One way you can sometimes get people to look past their short-term interests is maybe you come up with a proposal and say it doesn't go into place until about 20 years. So you have sort of a veil of ignorance as to who is going to benefit from it, but you may think in theory it's the right idea or the right principle. So that's sort of it doesn't help you today, but it may be a way to get your reform somewhere down the road.
Huh, that's interesting. I don't think I've ever heard him talk about that. I love it. Okay, Fred's question. Does the Alabama case in the present Supreme Court term isn't that resolved by the 15th Amendment?
So, I mean, the debate. So this is the case. It's a case dealing with districts in Alabama. It's called Merrill versus Milligan. It has to do with the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which basically bans election practices that abridge the right to vote on the basis of race. And so it's what's known as a racial gerrymandering case. And so these are challenges brought to congressional maps or legislative maps saying that race has been taken into account in an inappropriate way when doing this districting. I think if you were the reason the Supreme Court, is taking this case is there is some debate about how the 14th and 15th Amendment apply in this context. And I think the justices may disagree over that. But in the end, that case is going to have a lot to say with how the court is going to look in the future, look in that case, but in the future at racial gerrymandering and sort of the use of race in the context of putting together district maps. Again, just to reemphasize what we said earlier, there are sort of two different sorts of challenges you can see before the Supreme Court dealing with gerrymandering. There's partisan gerrymandering, which are challenges saying a political party has drawn maps to benefit their party and harm the out party. The Supreme Court over time, just in a recent case, has said, no, we're not going to hear those sorts of challenges. But over time, racial gerrymanders are still challenges as the Supreme Court hears. And the Alabama case is going to do something to set new baselines or reaffirm old ones about how the court's going to go about analyzing racial gerrymandering claims.
Awesome. And those two court cases are kind of heavy, but we will send out a follow-up. We did a podcast last week that dives into those both. And I absolutely think these are the two court cases we're going to have to Jamel Bowie about on Friday too, so we can dive into them again. Tom, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I'm just double checking the Q&A and make sure I got all the questions. Yes, I did. And I think everybody did a great job in class today. Lots of good conversation in the chat. I appreciate you people. And Tom, fantastic class. Thank you for walking us through everything so quickly and all with only 5 minutes over. So I'm really proud of us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you, Kevin. Nice to see you, Jackson class. Okay, everybody. Bye, Rebecca. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.